Okay, it's time to start. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for United States Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar. This is a series of I will say webinars of conferences that we've been having at UC San Diego. On the title is Tracking Mexico's Transformation. We believe that it's very important to give an assessment of what's happening in Mexico. And this is, during the emergency, the first time that we come back to do this series, Tracking Mexico's Transformation. And I believe it's very important, the topic we're discussing today, which is the future female equality and the Mexican left. So we have three wonderful speakers, three wonderful panelists, but I want to give, before I introduce them to you, I want to give the floor to Dr. Cecilia Farfán. She is a research director of our programs on security at USMEX, as we call it, our center, the one who thought about this webinar. So Ceci, why don't you explain us what are the goals in this conversation with Monica, with Estefania, and with Ana, that I will introduce after you explain us the goal of this webinar. Please, Cecilia, go ahead.
Thank you, Rafael. Yes, we're very excited to have our speakers today. Basically, what we want to do is, before coronavirus hit, there was a very active movement by feminists and just non-government organizations in Mexico protesting the perceived government inaction against violence or violence against women. So what we want to do is really, of course, coronavirus has exacerbated the problems of domestic violence, as recent data have shown, but we really want to have a conversation of this larger issue within Mexico, which is equality and what's happening with women. And so the goal today is really to put in context the vanishing from public spaces this day without women that happened on March 9th, and really understand what is going on in terms of, on the one hand, measuring this violence, but also really what are the public policies that have been enacted or not in this administration.
Thank you, Ceci. I do believe that it's very important that our center helps to strengthen the conversation about why is that we live in a peak of violence against women in Mexico. And so we will have three wonderful panelists. Estefania Vela Barba. She holds an LLM from the Yale Law School, where she's currently developing her doctoral research. She is the executive director of Intersecta, a feminist research and advocacy organization committed to end gender discrimination in Mexico through the promotion of intersectional and evidence-based policies. Welcome, Estefania. We also have Ana Pekova. She's the executive director of the X Justicia para las Mujeres. She has worked on issues of human rights over 15 years. She holds a master's in political philosophy from the University of York in England and a diploma of research issues and transparency and access to information from LSE, London School of Economics. And we also have Monica Meltis, a former student of mine. Welcome, Monica. Monica is the executive director of Data Civica. She has been there since 2017, and she has worked on projects about human rights violations and disappearing people. She holds a BA in political science and international relations at Titan. Thank you for being with us. And I will start with Estefania. Estefania, I wonder if you could give us the context about March 9, a day without women. Why did you organize that day, and what has been the impact of the day? Would you say that we could talk about an important impact of that day? Yours is the floor, Estefania. The idea, we'll have a small presentation of our three panelists, and then we'll open to questions. For all of you participating, there's a Q&A button there. We'll welcome all your questions, and we'll definitely give you your questions to our panelists. So please, we will waiting for your questions. Please, Estefania.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to have this Very interesting, important conversation, even if it's only online. I know we don't have much time, so I'll get right to it. I know there, especially from those I think that are not in Mexico or not necessarily in feminist circles, these past March 8th and March 9 were a surprise, but I do believe that they're not that new. We have seen a variety of protests over the last 4 or 5 years that every single year become more and more massive. At the same time, these protests cannot be understood in the last 5 years, is that there's been around 30 years of feminist work around the state, around law, around public policy, trying to change policies for them to finally work for women. There have been several issues that feminists have been working on, and I think they're important because on March 8th, March 9th, we could see all of them together working in tandem. The first, of course, is the issue of femicides, which again, has been a feminist issue in Mexico, at least since the mid-1990s, which is when the murders of women in the city of Juarez began. Ever since then, feminists have been trying to push for recognition of this violence, for the state to recognize this violence, and for a reduction of this violence in a variety of media and fora. The second, of course, has been abortion, has been sexual and reproductive rights. In recent years, we have the issue of disappearances. We also have the issue of harassment, which has been particularly a mobilizing point in universities and in the streets. So we already had all of this mobilization, all of this work being done. And I think it didn't matter what was the party in charge, what was the government in charge, the mandate was clear. We need to make this world a better place for women. We need to make this world a world that is actually equal. But of course, the government changed. It was finally a self-identified leftist government that made a variety of promises. I know there can be many discussions, but in my mind, feminism and the right are not have nothing to do. So it was going to be a natural alliances in many ways. So a government premised on equality, a government premised on changing a lot of the policies that had led us to the moment where Mexico is now. On the one hand, economic policies, on the other, policies around violence. For example, their promise about reducing or eradicating the militarization of public security. Now, what happened when the new government came in, and this is important, I know that Morena is not just the president, Morena also has a very important presence in the Congress, and it's gaining presence at the state level as well. No? And the government came in, and I think, I'm sure Monica and Ana can get into it, but at least on my part, there were 4 changes that became very worrisome. The first is the increase. And it's important because this all happened in a matter of 3 months. And I think it's part of the entire thing that has happened in the last year and a half. Number 1, they increased the crimes that warrant mandatory pretrial detention. And they not only refused to take the military out of public security, but they tried to constitutionalize the militarization of public security. So what we have is a strengthening of mano dura politics that have screwed the country in general, but I think the 3 organizations' research has proven how they have also screwed women in particular. For example, in Mexico, we have a disproportionate amount of women in pretrial detention. And instead of reducing that, we're increasing the number of crimes, thus allowing more women to be in prison. The military has contributed to the increase in the murders of women. And instead of pulling back on that strategy is only being strengthened. Now, in addition to this, we also had a cutback of all civil society money, including money for women's shelters. And this is one of the basic things where we didn't think we would have to fight for women's shelters. It was a promise. The discussion was supposed to be, how do we improve them? But with the sweep of a pen, they were originally cut back. And fourth, daycare for children. For years, we had daycare that covered women that were not necessarily in formal employment. And again, this program was cut back and it was substituted, and this is important. First, they slashed the budget in half. And then what little budget was left, they reassigned it through a new program. So this, again, was the first 3 months of the new government. And it was all of these points affecting women in different ways. But then what happened was, and I'll get to it, I know I don't have that much time left, but there was a case in Mexico City involving supposed rape by members of the police of a minor. And what we saw is what we've been saying for many, many years, which is that instead of investigating this case appropriately, what we saw was a mishandling of the case in every possible way. So feminists at this point rallied around the case, and this became famously known as the Brillantina, because they went to protest in front of the police in Mexico City government, and they threw glitter to the head of the security minister. And this entire discussion about how feminist protests became an issue. You know, this idea like we're all against violence against women, but you need to protest adequately. You know? And I think this has marked the last few months. And precisely what we keep seeing over the last few months is even more protests and more protests and more protests until we reached finally the 8th of March and the 9th of March, which again have as a previous point, 3 different femicides. First, the femicide of Abril in November is when we found out about this killing. This woman makes a complaint against her partner for violence, for trying to kill her. A criminal trial is started, but instead of linking him or doing the research or charging him with attempted femicide, he is charged with only family violence. And through other series of judicial proceedings, he was originally in pretrial detention, but he was released. And around 1 week after he was released, she was killed. That's one. The second is the case of Ingrid, which is this woman who was living intimate partner violence. She denounced her partner, nothing happened. And one day he killed her, and he killed her brutally. And the media ended up releasing her pictures on one of the Nota Roja newspapers, saying that it was Cupid's fault. And the third case, and this is around February, the third case was a case of Fatima, 8-year-old, who was kidnapped after leaving her school. She was raped, killed, and thrown in a garbage bag. And she was found days later. So we have all these brutal cases around which we've been fighting for literally 30 years. And everything that the governments have implemented don't seem to be working. And instead of seeing an immediate action plan, reviewing what has been done and failed before, what we saw on behalf of several authorities was, again, a complaint as to feminists complaining. So I think this was the last time, what finally just enraged everybody. I think the case of Fatima too, this idea of children's innocence, and this I think is one of the points of difference between this last series of protests with previous years, is that we saw a lot of people that are not necessarily part of the feminist movement protesting. And on March 8th, it became the biggest protest in the history of the Mexican feminist movement. And the unifying call was an end to violence and an effective response on behalf of all the governments. So I think, I don't know if I'm really doing the context, but again, so we have a strong feminist movement getting stronger by the minute. We have increasing violence. As many have said, on average, 10 women are killed on every day. Every single year for the past 3 years, the rate of homicide killings of women keep breaking records of the year before. And what we see again is ineffective government policies. No matter what they seem to do, we don't see a decrease in violence in any single space. So I think that's the context. No? And after March 8th, the other call was on March 9 for a day without women. It's this idea that if you don't value us, if you don't think we're important, if you don't think our lives are important, we're going to disappear from society for you to see what it's like. If you think that women being killed is not important, we're going to disappear so you can see what that feels like, not having us, not being able to hug us, not being able to kill us, to kiss us. So I think that was the purpose. And about the impact, we'll we'll see. But I think this is a movement, again, that has been around for long and will continue to be around for the time being until I think reality changes.
Thank you very much, Stefania. This is very good, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. I already have quite a few, but let me go to Monica Meltis. Monica, how difficult is to compile statistics in Mexico about violence against women? Could you share with us your ideas and your thoughts about this? So you're not only sharing your ideas, but also your data. This is wonderful, Monica.
Thank you very much. I would like to, I don't know if you can see my screen. I would like to share just a little bit of context on data.
Monica, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's
just
it.
as Stefania was talking about, one of the most important getting us together during the 8th and the 9th of March has to do with femicides and homicides. And right now, with the data we have, it is quite impossible to know what the number of femicides, for starters, we're having in Mexico. And this is why I want to talk a little bit about homicides and not femicides, because this is like the first reflection I would like to say, is that we have 32 different codes in Mexico, and it is very hard to compare the number of femicides with these codes, which basically means that we have to look at homicides. Femicide is a rather new crime in law, which means that it is hard to compare it in time, but also in geography, since they have different definitions in different states. So the first thing I would like to say regarding the context on homicide has to do with this graph, which is basically the homicide rates we have been having throughout, well, 20 years for now. And this is something I want to show because in order to get to this administration, I think we have to understand, as Stefania also said, what was the picture before this, no? So basically we were coming from a place since 2000, for example, where the rate of homicide was decreasing up to the point to 2007, when we got to the lowest, both for men and women in the country. And after that, the militarization of security in the country started to increase the rate both for men and women in different proportions, but they both increased up to 2011, where we got the highest rate, and then in 2018, the highest again, and then probably last year also the higher. And I say probably because we're only using the death certificates for this, which are generated with 1 year of 1 year late, no? So right now we only have information for 2008 and 18. This increase, however, has not been homogeneous between amongst men and women. For men, the public space has always been the place where most homicides occur, and for women, before 2009, the place where most homicides occur were their homes. I can share these slides with you if you want to check it with carefully. I know we have a little time, not a lot of time, so I'm gonna fasten up a little bit. Also, something that changed is that the rate of homicides against women after the militarization process became 2 times higher at home, but also almost 4 times higher at public spaces, no? So we see a context in which the violence has been increasing not only for women, but not only at their homes, which is the violence that was typically associated to femicides, but also outside their homes. Also, the most vulnerable women in this time were women aged between 20 and 27, which increased almost in 4 times their homicide rates. And for women between 28 and 35, it became 3 times higher, you know? Which also can give us a lot of context of how this increase in violence started to represent in different populations amongst women. And this is also has to do with what Estefania was talking about on the context of, on the first hand, an increasing feminist and more visible movement, and on the second hand, a lot of violence, the patterns changing. No? The homicide rate of women by fire guns became almost 4 times higher, which is also something that we have to talk about. I think in the Mexican context, the feminist movement is not very involved with the gun control movement as perhaps in the US. So I wanted to show this slide also to give this context and to talk about the data we're lacking afterwards. But still some difference remain, no? Proportionally, more women are being killed than men in their homes. And for adult women, their home is the most risky space, no? This is the percentage of homicides in households in different ages. So we can see that from 0 to 11 years, there is no difference between men and women. But after 12, the patterns change completely, no? So basically, women are more vulnerable in their houses, but they're also living more vulnerabilities outside their houses. In proportion, again, more women are killed by suffocation, are being stabbed, or being poisoned. They're also being killed by bodily force and firearms. Just as Stefania was talking about, these 3 cases is that during the first part of the year were very, very clear, no? And just this, I wanted to talk because I think it is very important to understand that we have a lack of data. We have, on the first hand, incomplete variables. For example, the variable of family violence is not included in 91% of the homicides cases of women analyzed in this period. There's also lacking information on the kinship between the victim and the alleged aggressor. It is not included in 95% of the homicides of women, and we also have a complete lack of information regarding indigenous women, no? And we also have non-existent variables, which are basically regarding people's sexual orientation, gender identity, the skin color, immigration status, whether or not they have a specific disability, no? And this basically means that we cannot know a lot about the homicides, no? We cannot identify if victims were killed in the same event, or we're not able to know where the body was found. Most of the times we can't know a lot about perpetrators as well, sex, age, and relationship to the victim, which is basically something very important if we are trying to understand if one killing was a femicide or not. And we also have information, we lack information of what are the signs of the aggressor prior to the murder, and also regarding the body of the victim, no? So we don't know if there's so many cases where we don't know if the woman was tortured before being killed or was raped, and a series of other violence that are important to determine if this was a femicide or a gender-related homicide, no? And I wanted to show this because in order to talk about the institutional opportunities we have in Mexico, I think that right now the current administration is betting a lot on the increased militarization of the public forces instead, or maybe not necessarily instead, but not not betting on generating more strong institutions, no? As Estefania says, we have been for 30 years generating different kinds of institutions that are supposedly to take care of the violence against women. But right now, the increased militarization is generating a context in which women are being more violented and in different proportions than men and than men, no? And we have definitely weak institutions. There is a lack of human, financial, and there is not enough technical resources to act. We also have a lot of bureaucratic latencies, and there's a lack of transparency and accountability. Specifically, the lack of transparency and accountability has to do with regarding militarization. We don't know how much money is being spent in which programs, and I think that there has been also an argument on generating military forces that are feminist or that are gender sensitive, no? And there's different programs being done apparently for that, but we cannot access to what are the programs, what are the money that has been spent on that, how this has to do, how this reflects on the act of the military infield, no? So this is just like a little bit on that. I think that there's a lot of things that we need to better understand from the data in order to tackle the problem. And I would also like to say that the government, as also Estefania says, has reduced some of the programs on INEGI. That's one of the institutions, it's the most important institution that gets data from society. And I think that we are not doing enough on better understanding the problem and the differences amongst even women, no? In a more intersectional way. So I think I'm gonna stop now because I think the time is over, but I'm open.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. This is wonderful. I mean, you just gave us a very good panorama, and you let us know that we are basically acting in the dark because there's very few data, and I will come back to you. I'm sure there's going to be questions about it. What we can do to improve this data? But let's go to Ana Pecova. Ana, what is your take on AMLO's administration and the Mexican left and this increasing violence against women? Thank you, Ana, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to share this space with these amazing women, and thank you so much to the university for organizing it. Anna, I want to say a few words about public policies, in the present context, but I think it's very important to, in order to see the contrast, to say a few words about what we had with the previous administration. Without much circling, I want to go straight to the point and say that women have not fared well, not with this government, not with the previous one neither, for different reasons. And I want to go into that because I think there are some important lessons to be drawn from both experiences. And let's see if we can incorporate them and make things better in the future to come, in the feminist future we're all expecting to see. So basically, with the previous government, gender mainstreaming was a huge deal. It was all over on the political agenda, and it translated in a lot of resources. Huge resources were invested in promoting gender mainstreaming, policies that promote women's rights, especially. We had In Mujeres, which is the National Institute of Women, whose budget grew over 10 times over the last 7-8 years. Then there were gender units opened in all of the public institutions. We had lots of specialized institutions being opened too. However, nothing significantly changed. It did not translate into access, better access of services for women, into better access to justice, nothing. And I think it's because a closer look at the policies that were being promoted or how money were being spent reveals that spending was being done without much sense. There was zero accountability, as you know, it has been mentioned already, and we've even found cases of corruption. Some of the main strategies that were being pursued was, one, opening up specialized institutions. So we ended up with, I don't know, specialized prosecutors' offices that only attend cases of violence against women. We had, for example, FEVIMTRA, which is this famous fiscalia which prosecutes human trafficking and sexual violence against women, and which gave zero results. Absolutely no case has been resolved. Then we've had the Women Justice Centers, which are basically a copy. They have been imported from San Diego, actually, from the Family Justice Center there. It's a 24/7 one-stop shop, you know, where a woman that has lived domestic violence can find all the services that she needs. But in Mexico, the implementation of this policy has basically been reduced to sandcastles. There is nothing behind. There is no stability. They have no resources, no staff of its own, no work plans, nothing. And the importance here is that weak institutions, they also mean lack of access to services. You know, there's no services for women who are victims of violence. Then the other important strategy that was pursued was training workshops, lots of training workshops for all public officials that work in the government. Millions and millions of resources have been invested to that end. We recently published a report which follows up how the judiciary has been, how much money has the judiciary spent to incorporate what we call gender dimension into their work. And honestly, not only there is no results, it's impossible to follow up the results, because in Mexico, we have huge opacity in the work of the judiciary. To start with, we have no access to sentences, to judicial rulings, and that's a major obstacle. But we've also found cases of corruption where, for example, in the state of Veracruz, from where we have this famous governor, Duarte, which is currently in prison for money laundering, for corruption. It's the biggest corruption case we've had here in Mexico. We found that in one single year in 2009, they spent 34 million pesos. That's around $1.5 million US, I don't know, back at the time, to train a little bit more than 100 judges. So you do the average and you say, there is no way, even if you had sent them for a year in Harvard, which you didn't, you wouldn't have been able to spend this money on training on women's rights, on gender and human rights. And not how to forget that from that state, from that court tribunal, we have some of the worst cases, like the case of, what was her name? The Porquis, a very famous case where zero gender perspective was incorporated. So just to conclude, just to round up about what was happening with the previous administration, the main lesson, I guess, is access to resources is very important. We need resources to implement, to turn into practice the policies that we want to promote, but it's not sufficient just by itself. It needs to be accompanied by very strong, well-developed accountability mechanisms. We need to have strong mechanisms for citizen participation too. Otherwise, lots of resources, they don't necessarily translate into better services for women. So now, what happened now? What is happening now? What happened with the arrival of this, not that new government, AMLO's government? We have basically, it is a government that won, as Estefania was saying, on a platform of the need to fight inequality. However, the comprehension, how they comprehend inequality, it completely excludes gender. It only envisages class inequality. Gender is a non-issue. It's not a factor that leads to inequality. And that has translated also into the policies they've promoted, how they're spending resources. So one, there's no more funds for gender mainstreaming. It's a non-issue. All of the money has been channeled into social programs, direct cash transfers. We have direct cash transfers to the elderly, to young people, to mothers, to families who have a person with a disability, which is okay. I mean, money, it is an effort to get money to people who are most in need. However, we must not confuse that one, we also need to invest in services. It's not one or the other. And two, this is not the main excuse that has been used is that women are the main or are the most numerous beneficiaries of these programs. And it is true, but it is because we have more women among the elderly, we have more women who take care of children, of people with disability. These are, we must not get confused, these are not funds aimed at reducing gender inequality. These are not funds aimed at promoting women's rights. And we can see that very clearly when we look at programs such as Sembrando Vida, which is sowing life, or I don't know how to translate it, which is money to promote growth of agricultural growth, where we see that women are only 30% of the beneficiaries. And it has to do with the fact that women are not landowners. They just don't appear there, and we're missing the money to equalize, to bring women at the same level as men. And then, as Estefania was mentioning, I think some of the main, what has marked this administration is actually cuts, reduction of public policies, which were aimed at promoting women's participation, such as in the public life, such as daycare centers. There is a reduction in full-time schools. And I think it perhaps it's not that directly related, but it is related with violence against women, because the numbers, what they suggest is that women who are economically independent, who participate, who have access to work, also have face less risk of violence, and they also have more options to leave situations of violence. And now we have the coronavirus crisis is here, you know, and it's gotten us completely unprepared. We have very weak institutions. The lack of funding for shelters for battered women has left women completely unprotected, all on their own. There's nothing out there for them. All of the institutions, the judiciary, the prosecutors' offices, they've all suspended activities. They've all said that we're not operating, we're in an emergency situation, go back home. And it's amazing the huge gaps that are out there for women who have lived violence. At the same time, if I could just draw up on some lessons, this is a government with a huge participation of women in all levels on key decision-making positions. We've never had women in such key positions like gobernación, economy, work. All of these ministries are in the hands of women. So what we see, the main lesson is that the mere presence of women is not enough. It's not enough to have a feminist government. We've never had that many women, and we've never lost that much in such a short time as what we've lost currently in Mexico in the current context. And just so that I don't end on such a negative tone, I want to say among the policies that have been promoted or laws that have been promoted recently, and I think will have a positive effect on women, even though it wasn't designed or formulated thinking about women, is the amnesty law, which has been very controversial in Mexico, and it comes at a controversial moment. However, the group that will get most benefit out of it is actually women who are in prison for drug-related crimes. I don't know if you know, but the war on drugs, drug-related crimes, has been the main reason, the main driver of incarceration of women in Mexico and in the region. I think the United States has a pretty similar situation. Many of these women are victims of a punitive policy. They shouldn't be in prison. Many of them come from disadvantaged contexts. They're mothers, they're single mothers, and huge injustices have been done by incarcerating them. So I think it is something that we've welcomed after a very long time of negative decisions that have negative impact of women. We've finally seen something that could potentially benefit women. Other than that, we're just continuing with much of the same policies, continuation of militarization. The war on drugs is still active. It is only now a war on drug use. It's not that much war on drug trafficking, corruption, and I fear migration. I fear corruption has continued too. So I'm going to leave there my first presentation, my first contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. We have a wonderful panorama now, thanks to the three of you. And I wonder if Stefania, Monica, or Joanna would like to ask each other something. And let me give the floor to Cecilia Farfán. Ceci, would you like to make a comment? And then I will give the floor to, can you listen to me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Ceci, go ahead, and then we'll give the floor to Stefania, then to Monica, to Ana, and then we open up. We have quite a few questions here, but let's go, Ceci.
Thank you. So we have a very interesting paradox here, right? Because a lot of the narrative around the war on drugs, especially as it relates to men, is that, you know, they deserve to die because somehow they were involved in something, right? En algo andaban metidos, and this narrative that just sees them as criminals and therefore not deserving of rights. Ironically, this is the same argument that has been used to minimize violence against women for many years, way before the war on drugs happened, right? Like, well, se lo buscó, she was provoking men, you know, somehow. So how do you see this narrative now that it's, you know, the link between this war on drugs narrative that, you know, relates to violence against men, but also that has affected women for so long? Do you see that as protests have grown, as Stefania explained, that this is a narrative that is eroding, or do you see that it's here to stay and it's going to affect violence against women even more?
Go ahead, Stefania.
Can I also answer several? The first thing that I want to say is that the data that Monica presented is part of a report that can be found online that Data Civica did together with the Sexual Reproductive Rights Area from CIDE last year, that shows, I think, two very important things. On the one hand, that there are some gender differences as to how men and women are killed. And this provides evidence to why, in some cases, you need to take those differences into account if you really want to reduce violence against women. But the other thing that is crucial is that at the same time, since 2007, the homicides of men and women look every day more alike. You know? And that report ends with a suggestion. If we want to understand what happened in 2007, we need to look, among other issues, into the militarization of public security. And one of the questions is, can we actually make that link? And I just want to say at Intersecta, we have made an alliance with Laura Tuesta from the CIDE Drug Policy Program to actually see how the confrontations between Sedena and supposed criminal groups, supposed because we don't know, led or did not lead to an increase in the homicides of men and women. And what we do see is that they actually officially, formally increased the killings, not just of men, but of women too. So there is that link. I'm not saying that militarization explains everything. I think Cecilia, Monica, Ana, we all know that violence is hyper-local, and we need to take into account a variety of factors. What is happening in Chihuahua right now is not necessarily what happened in Chihuahua in 2007. What is happening in Michoacán now is not necessarily what was happening in Michoacán 4 years ago. So we, of course, we have everything that has to do with extractivist policies and all the killings of defenders of land. We have to look into organized crime, but we also have to look into the military. So I want to answer one of those questions, and this also being linked to the decree that was published today, which formalizes something that was put in the Constitution a year and a half ago. Now, and I think this also connects to what you're saying, Cecilia, and I think Ekis has on previous occasions spoken about the two wars against women, like the traditional machista war, but also how the war on drugs has impacted women. Ekis, Ana's organization, has been, for example, tracking perfectly the increase in the incarceration of women. And now we also see the increase in the homicides of women, the increase in the tortures of women. So what we have is the two discourses. On the one hand, you're whores, you had it coming, which we saw again with Ingrid 3 months ago. It was Cupid's fault. It is never patriarchy, it is never machismo, it is never those perpetrating the violence. It is always either women or just animal man who can't help it. No? So that discourse is still there. And on the other hand, we also have this looming discourse about how if you killed in a particular context, you had it coming because you have link to organized crime. So either women fall into the whore dichotomy or women fall into the crime, organized crime dichotomy. And I think to me, feminism fights again any sort of discourse that reduces people's humanity to one single fact. So for me, as feminists, we would have to be fighting against any discourse that justifies people being killed, people being disappeared, whether it disproportionately impacts women or whether it disproportionately impacts men, because I think they're all related to that. You know? And just to finish up, a lot of, for example, the US literature, as you know, in the United States, there's a problem of mass incarceration. There's around 2.4 million people incarcerated, and scholars in the US have linked how there's almost this relationship of love between neoliberal policies and punitive policies. It's like neoliberal policies leave you to your own luck. You're just an individual who is not trying hard enough. And then punitive policies come in and punish you for supposedly not being enough. And at the same time, all those punitive policies, they're, anti-racism scholars articulate them as new forms of slavery because they literally allow people to be further exploited, further discriminated, further marginalized. And what I find interesting here is that in discourse, this government is entirely opposed to neoliberal policies, but one of the things they keep increasing and don't really question are the punitive policies. And they really cannot be in many ways disentwined. and that's also what's so scary. It's not just how their economic policies are not enough, but they're growing this huge, lethal, unchecked apparatus whose results we are already seeing, but because of opacity, like Monica said, our ability to keep tracking what's happening will not be the same. So that part is also very scary.
There's quite a few questions out there regarding Monica. I mean, how can we get better statistics, better numbers? And let me ask you, Monica, is there any Latin American country that has it right? Is there any country in the world? I hope there's one in Latin America that has good statistics and good data about violence against women.
Yes. I think that in Mexico, actually, comparatively to other countries, in some things, we have good data. Mm-hmm. INEGI is an institution that has a lot of, on the first hand, resources, but also have been doing a lot of work on generating statistics just in general. No? I think that particularly when looking at women's data, we see a reproduction, or for me, that's an interpretation, a reproduction of how some lives at the end do not matter as much as other lives, no? And that has to do with, for example, we might have better data for women, but not for all women, no? We have a lack of data for many different women, indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, that for many years in Mexico, we believed, no, because we were not documented it in data, that we do not have a Afro-descendant population, for example, no. So I would say that in how do we get this data? The INEGI right now is doing an interesting thing that has a group on experts on gender, but also in other subjects, a very diverse group on women experts in gender issues, in which Ana, Estefania, and I are part of. And they're starting to look out at what other data could be gathered, no? So that, for starters, I would say that's a good thing. The other thing I would say that has to do a lot with resources. We have to invest more on getting this data, no? A census is very, very expensive. And the census has been just generated this year, these past months. But there's not enough money apparently to get all of the questions there for one, that's one reason. And the other has to do a lot with, I would say, not understanding the intersectional parts of violence against women. And this, I would say, if we're gathering data, we do not need another encuesta that has to be specifically on violence against women. We do have several sources to get this information. What we need is to better understand how different women live this type of violence, or how different women or different compared with men. No? And I would say that's also another thing. The most important encuesta we have in Mexico to see the dynamics of the violence at home is only comparable for women, not comparable against men, to see if there is a difference between gender. And there's also only comparable for 15-year-old and older. So the first thing I would say has to do with, when talking about gender issues, we should always consider comparing with men, because then we're not able to know if that's a gender issue, I would say, no? And the other thing, regarding particularly femicides, we do not have a system that allows us to compare the femicide particularly in different codes. And that's also one question I was seeing in the questions you made, if there is any possibility, or do we believe that this government is gonna almost generate the same code for femicides. There is right now no evidence on that. But Estefania, that's the lawyer, could talk a little bit more about that. I think that would need to change the codes locally. And that's a process that has to do a lot with generating lobbying, specifically in this context. And I would also like to ask, like in a reflection kind of question, like I think that it is important that we have acknowledged that femicides are something important to look on. But I would say that in general, homicides, and in general, we need to have better information for homicides. For example, right now, and for diseases as well. Right now, we have to wait 1 year in order for SINAIS, that's the data set on health, that looks at the death certificates, just to understand the difference between the normal death rates and the deaths during COVID, no? Because the other data set that the Secretariado Ejecutivo de Seguridad Pública is a data set that shows us investigations on crime. And this has a lot of different issues that we should talk more about. But I would say that we need, in general, better data and more, and data that's more easily and accessible for most people to understand, I would say that. And this means more resources, and also a lot of more coordination between local governments and the federal government when giving this data.
Thank you, Monica. Anna, there's a comment and a question there. And it says, it's very chilling what I heard from Anna, that there's quite a few women within the AMLO's administration and nothing is happening. Is there a way to have a reform from within? And what is your take on this? And then, Estefania, if you want to address about Congress and laws regarding this violence, but let's go on, and I wonder if you want to comment on this comment, and please.
Right. Can I just say a couple of words on the war on drugs, because it's something that we've been following up on a lot from X. I think the impact has been so huge on women, on women's rights, and I wonder whether I'm still questioning the movement's capacity to make it a feminist issue. I think it has been so huge how the war on drugs has impacted women in Mexico. One, and it's been said, how it has changed the type of violence women live, the war on drugs, the militarization of public security, how it led to more women being killed in the public, in the street, even more than at home, how it has led to a huge number of forced disappearances of people who we don't know where they are. And then 9 out of 10 persons that are looking out for disappeared ones are women. It's an army of women that is out there looking for the disappeared people, and how it has had an impact on women, on their lives, on communities, and incarcerations, how it has how it has turned women into the fastest growing population in prison. The response to all of that is women on drugs. We find women in every possible moment of drug-related activities. Some women are growers, other women are, I don't know, they pack, they traffic, others sell drugs, but other are women users. And I want to link here to something that Monica was saying. What they all have in common is that they're all victims of gender discrimination. You know, you talk to women who are growers and they talk to you about how they work, you know, shoulder to shoulder with men. And yet when it comes the time to pay, to get money for the services they make, they're completely excluded from the chain. And something that's particularly worrisome for me is women users, how we have public policies which are designed having a certain type of women in mind. And for me, it's something that we cannot allow to have within a movement like the feminist movement, which is designed on, structured around the fight against inequality. We cannot filter and have policies for some women and not for others. So what we've seen is that women users are systematically excluded from public policies such as the Women Justice Centers. Over 50% of women who are users, who are locked against their will at treatment centers, they've all been victims of violence, mainly sexual violence, either at the treatment center or before getting there. And we've asked the Women Justice Centers, do you give attention? Do you provide attention to these women? And they all say no. Only out of 48 Women Justice Centers, only 8 responded, well, we do offer some services to women who are users, but only if they're users of tobacco or alcohol and they're in detox. So imagine if you smoke, you won't get access to the Women Justice Center. That is completely unacceptable. We cannot continue to think about policies that are designed only thinking about one type of woman in mind. It is the same about women with disabilities. It is the same when you talk about indigenous women. So we have a huge work to do there internally within the movement. Specifically about the government, I think what we see is that it is not enough to have women in key decision-making places. And there are many of them, I saw amongst the questions there, they were wondering themselves whether we're talking about feminists or not. We have lots of women who come from the feminist movement and who are now part of the government. Nonetheless, we've seen that they have very little action field. They cannot do anything. What we are seeing, what we are perceiving is a very centralized government. Everything, all the decision making is centered in one person, which is the president. And we see how it is irrelevant. The team around is completely irrelevant. There is this group who followed up the morning conferences. Every single morning, the president comes out and gives a couple of hours conferences where he addresses all of the main issues. And there was a follow-up. And when you look at the numbers, even though it's a parity government, it's the equal number of women as men who participate in the government, only 8% of those who have been given a little bit of space to talk next to the president are women. Wow. Only 20 times, on 20 occasions out of hundreds of morning conferences, there have been women saying something, addressing people from that arena. So you see how difficult it is even internally to do something. When I say that, of course, the military has had all the platform. After the president, the people who have had, those who have had most platform, most time, most space to talk from the mañanera is the army that talks a lot about priorities. But I think it's a very difficult context for women who are in the government. They have very little margin to do something, anything. So I think we need to I think the strategy is not from within the government. I think the strategy is from building community responses, mobilizing the society, seeking for greater citizen participation. I think the change has to come from elsewhere. It's very unlikely it's going to come from within the government.
Excellent, Anna. A wonderful response. There's quite a few questions there about if there's a need of a new institution, for example, to specialize on femicides. I wonder if you want to take a crack on it. And there were some questions about Congress. Could you start with this, Stefania, please?
Regarding specialized institutions, I think we already have specialized institutions. Ever since Juarez in the 1990s, one of the first and basic feminist demands is we need a specialized prosecutor to deal with the cases of femicides. And we have seen the strategies of specialized institutions being replicated in many spaces. Like Anna said, and X have been following, they created gender units within most public institutions, from Congress to the judiciary to the executive. We have specialized prosecutors for family violence, for sexual violence, for femicides. We have centers of justice for women. So we have seen the specialized strategy being deployed. What is being asked now, previously to the 8th of March, is a federalized or centralized special prosecutor. I think there are several critiques that can be made. The first, and just to take back what Ana said, there's a great study that was made by Alejandra Rios from 2013. That's how old they are. It's a study that shows how specialized prosecutors actually work. And what they show is that they are replicating many of the problems of our regular prosecutors' offices. They're underfunded, they're understaffed, they have a lot of bureaucracy. The prosecutors are overworked, they have no support. And the problem with specialized institutions can be even further. For example, in many states, they only have one. So if women go to a regular prosecutor's office, they're gonna send them to the specialized prosecutor's office, and you start losing women in the way. So it can be, and I understand the logic behind that strategy, but our own evidence, our own country shows just how careful you need to be about the implementation. The other thing that I want to say is, and I think part of the new government shows it, is we need to walk a very fine line because specialized institutions have the risk of then anything that has to do with women automatically can only be dealt with specialized institutions. And this is not the case. Like, women are 51% of the population. There are many policies that impact women, even if they don't have the brand women in its place. And we need to be very careful as to how we design these institutions. Again, the National Women's Institute was created in 2001. We have almost 20 years experience with these institutions. I'm not saying there's a logic behind them. So gender discrimination does impact women disproportionately. There are gender issues that need to be taken into account. But how you implement this, how you carefully thread the institutions, this needs to be an alert with which we need to be careful. I just want to answer one last question about the harmonization of criminal codes. And again, there is a call for a unified criminal code. Many feminist groups are in favor of this unified criminal code. One of the arguments being offered for it is that we're going to finally have only one definition of femicide, only one definition of harassment. There are many countries that don't have a federal system. The options are there, but I think, again, going back to the importance of the local, is that we do need to be critical of these institutional designs. There's also a reason for federalism. There's a reason for basing our strategies on local institutions that know the terrain, that know the communities. For those that are interested, for example, specifically in security, or that everybody that works on police reform knows that you need local authorities, you need to know what the problem is locally. So that can also be, again, I'm not saying no, but I think our own evidence, after 20, 30 years of feminist policy reforms, we also have enough evidence that it's not enough to just stamp something with the framing of women. It's not enough to create specialized institutions. Until we don't get into the nitty-gritty, we're going to keep building, like Ana said, sandcastles.
Thank you very much, Estefania. Laura Araujo from Tijuana, Nevadora, she's telling us, she believes that in social media, there's a lack of coordination about gender issues. And she's asking us if there's any suggestion by you on a website, or how can you better coordinate on social media? And I believe it will be important. There's a few questions about what the US could do. Is there any lessons, good positive lessons from the US? Because of course I believe we have quite a few attendees from Calibaja. And is there anything about that we have to duplicate out of the US? Is there any good thing that we could just try to imitate? Who would like to answer? Says, would you like to make a comment, a question?
I would.
Yes, Monica.
I don't know if Ceci was going to say something. I just wanted to say that because there's also a question on how people from the US could contribute to this conversation. And I would say that when looking at the feminist movement in Mexico and the priorities and the different priorities as diverse as they are, I think that there is a lack maybe of focus on gun control that I think that in the US is more clear. It's been more, the feminist movement has it more clear that we should be fighting for a better gun control. And that I would say that has a lot to do with what happens in the US regarding gun control is very, it affects a lot in the Mexican context. So I would say that we could learn some lessons from the feminist movement regarding the gun control, and also regarding what Ana was saying, no, that has to do with the justice system. I think that in Mexico there's some narrative that as Ceci was saying, that's still very, very like deep in the cultural moment we're living, that points that we should be, the individual responsibilities of our actions, and also that has to do a lot with the prison system and the justice system, that I think we could also maybe not like the lessons in the policies, but perhaps the discussions that you're having that are not very common in here regarding gun control and justice.
Thank you, Monica. Ceci, would you like to say something? And then we'll give the floor to Ana and Estefania.
Just wanted to share from your question that at USMEX we're working on a digital platform in partnership with El Colegio de Mexico called mexicoviolence.org, and we have a gender section. We're still beta testing, but this would be also another platform for getting your research, Intersecta, X, Data Civica, to a wider audience. So,
Ana, would you like to say something? Let's start to just, we have another 5-7 minutes to go. So I believe this is of the utmost importance for Mexico, for US-Mexican relations. We will not have an improved Mexico. We will not be, if we cannot able to close the gap between men and women. So let us know, Ana, Estefania, and Monica, how can be of help to your efforts. I believe that in June, if it's fine with you, we should do another webinar and think about, how COVID-19 is affecting your cause, because we have heard a lot of stories about increased gender violence, especially in homes nowadays. So I would love to team up with you and continue to do these webinars, continue with this conversation. It is important. I know there's a lot of interest in the US about this, so let's let's think about, let's have a brainstorm. We should invite other centers here like Tijuana Innovadora and some other groups because this is important, this is very relevant, and it will be, I mean, and I'll believe that if we could help you a little bit as facilitators to strengthen this dialogue, it will be, I mean, it will be important. So Estefania, Anna, Monica, why don't we have a last comment? And gets a lot of questions has to do, I mean, how can we improve this? I mean, what is what we can do? And I know there's not a silver bullet on this, unfortunately. It's not only drugs, it's many things, but I wonder if you could give us your sense of, I mean, if what is what you will try to do to at least to deter this peak of violence against women and to make sure that we will improve the situation in Mexico regarding femicide. And so why don't we start with you, Anna, and we'll go around. And again, thank you very much for participating in this. This has created a lot of interest here, and hopefully we will continue to do this. Go ahead, Anna, please.
Thank you, Rafael. I think you're already doing a lot, you know, by opening up this space, by hearing each other. I think the situations that we're living in Mexico and you guys in the United States, I think they're not that different lately. In fact, one of the questions were, what can we do? How can we collaborate better? What lessons are there to be shared? And I think when I was talking, like last year, I was talking to people who live in the United States, and they were all telling me, you know, calm down, Nana. You know, I was complaining, oh, it's so difficult. They're reducing funds for key public policies. And they would tell me, you know, if I could say one positive thing that came out of the Trump administration is that all of us, we became much more engaged. We all started volunteering, supporting a local NGO, a local group, you know, doing something to try to be part of the change. And I think, and they would tell me, you know, the first year is the most difficult, but it's going to get better. And I think we're now exactly at that point. What I see is that we've never had a poor civil society like this huge fund, Pro Equidad, which was money to support a feminist civil society so it could monitor all the efforts that are being done by the government to promote gender equality. They were completely suspended. Most organizations, especially that operate on local level, like first level organizations who provide direct services, they're very, very poor. They have no resources. They operate with no money, with reduced time, with reduced staff. Nonetheless, we've never had a more fierce civil society. And I want to stress that now, as we're going through the coronavirus crisis, what we've seen is that the prosecutor's offices, the police, the judiciary, they've all suspended activities. They've suspended activities without asking themselves, you know, what do women who are victims of violence need? How can we do this suspension? How can we proceed with this suspension without stepping on their rights? They don't care. The only ones that have been out there for women who are in these critical situations have been civil society organizations. It has been there, the national network of shelters for battered women, who are pretty much coordinated and run by civil society. So they've been there, you know, just helping people, helping women to take them out of risk situations and place them at a safe, secure place until this crisis calms down and they can place a formal complaint. So I think that's where the biggest bet should go in the future. I think we need to turn towards local civil society, support them, help them, because I think that's the only thing that has been out there for women in this crisis.
Thank you, Anna. Monica, and then we'll give the last word to Stefania. And Cecilia, you're closest.
Yes, I would say that I agree completely with Anna. For me, particularly this year and with the 8th and 9th of March demonstrations, has been very clear is that women are getting more organized. There is still more organization to be done, but I think that women are going out to the streets. We're getting more organized, and I think that for all of the work that feminist groups have been doing for the past 30 years is starting to see in the public and in other women that we perhaps didn't know that we're willing to go out and protest. No, so I would say that's a good thing, and I would say that also regarding the collaboration between the U.S. and Mexico, there's so many interesting things going on right now during the coronavirus about discussions that we're having, like without talking about borders, and a very horizontal conversation of what are the things that we will not tolerate after the COVID crisis. And there is a lot of interesting conversations going on in a very, very plural and diverse way amongst women and men from both the US and Mexico, and talking about particularly immigration and racial bias and gender issues that are very important to continue having, and to see a way in which when the crisis ends, we will be more organized, even more organized, to go out and say, this is what we were thinking during the virus, and now we are demanding these points, no? And I'm sorry that we didn't answer all of the questions, but
we'll send it to you.
but if you send it, we can answer it. And well, thank you very much for opening this space and for inviting us.
You're very welcome. Estefania.
Just the problem continues. Everything points to the fact that COVID is going to exacerbate a lot of the inequalities that we've been wanting to eradicate for years. You know, there are many reports suggesting that we're not only going to see more people being thrown into poverty after this, but again, the gender dimension of this is going to be brutal. So I think that, and women are going to continue. Women are going to keep fighting. As Ana said, women right now are on the front line. They're going to continue being on the front line, and they're going to continue demanding more. So the question is, how do we actually support and do more for that? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. I just want to mention to our attendees that we'll circulate the video of the seminar, and of course, any links that our panelists want to send on to us, we'll share them with along with the video to all the people who registered. So any information that you would like to share, we're happy to also share with those who registered.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, Meltis, Ana Pekova, and Stefania Vela. I mean, it has been a wonderful webinar, a wonderful discussion, and we have lots of questions, and you can tell a lot of very goodwill in all of those comments. And thank you for participating in this webinar. Thank you, and continue to do your good work. We need leadership. There's there's a very important need in Mexico and in Latin America for persons and organizations like you, like yours. So thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. And Cecilia heads our research on violence. I believe that I guess we badly need to concentrate and to focus on women violence, because it's awful what's happening not only in Mexico but in our entire region. This is very much a Latin American issue that is there, and I believe that the current crisis will create some problems, and it will create some opportunities. So let's continue this conversation. Thank you all for being here, and we'll continue this conversation again. Let's try to do something in June. And thank you, Ana. Thank you, Stefania. Thank you, Monica. And thank you, Ceci, for thinking on this and for coordinating this webinar. Muchas gracias.
Of course.